Beautiful. Music can transport the soul, can't it?
Yes.
So thank you. I'm almost afraid to say anything. Okay. The title of my message this morning is Becoming a Friend of God. But it's really more than that. It is going to give you the key to interpreting John's entire gospel. If you listen carefully. How many of you have read the Gospel of John? Raise your hand.
Parts of it.
Good. How many have read all 4 of the Gospels in the New Testament? Okay. More people raise their hand having read John than the 4. Because John is the most popular one, isn't it? I wonder why. We're going to figure out why that is. So, part of the scriptural reference for this sermon was from John 15, verses 12 to 17. This is a couple of those verses. Jesus is speaking. He says, I no longer call you servants. He's talking to his disciples. For a servant does not know what his master does. But I have called you friends, for everything that I have heard from my Father, I have made known to you. So a friend is someone who hears everything Jesus says from the Father. Keep that in mind. Now, the reason why the Gospel of John is the most popular is because it was written to us. Go to the next slide. Just a little bit of a history lesson before we start. This is a listing of the 4 canonical Gospels in chronological order as they were written. Mark was written just before the destruction of the Jerusalem temple in 70 AD. It represents the ideas of Paul. And because Paul's churches were faded away, actually, after his death, this gospel wasn't used that much. Matthew wrote after the destruction of Jerusalem with a particular reason to reach Jews living in Palestine, because once the temple had been destroyed, the Jews realized that their religion had to change in order to keep their culture alive. And Matthew wrote to tell them they needed to accept Jesus as their Messiah because Jesus was coming back very shortly. They did not heed his message, so Matthew's gospel was a failure in terms of reaching its audience because Judaism became rabbinic Judaism following the teaching of the Pharisees. Luke's gospel has the most complex language of all 4 of them. And he wrote to an educated Greek elite of his day, and that gospel failed to reach its audience as well. You don't read about Greek philosophers being converted by reading Luke's gospel. The prior 3 had specific smaller targets in mind, but John addressed his gospel to the entire Roman Empire, the entire world as he knew it. Matthew, Mark, and Luke use Mark's narrative framework. The events listed in Mark provide the framework for Matthew and Luke. Matthew and Luke use Mark's story of Jesus, but they insert teaching of Jesus into it. Very precious. But John wrote his gospel very, very simply. A first-year Greek student can translate anything written by John. He wanted it to be simple so every person, no matter what their status in life in the Roman Empire, would understand it. They would get the message. And this gospel succeeded. Jesus was a friend of God. By the time Jesus died, he had 120 friends of God. Within 2 centuries, most people in the Roman Empire were Christians, friends of God. How in the world does that happen? Except through the power of God and the Gospel of John. So we've got to understand this gospel. We've got to be able to interpret it for us. That's the reason why it's the most popular. But unfortunately, it's also the most mysterious and the least understood of all the Gospels. But in order to understand it, we have to put ourselves as if we lived in the Roman Empire, because that was the audience that John was writing to. We have to hear the words of his gospel just the way he meant them to be heard. So next slide. We have to discover how things worked in the Roman Empire. We got to put ourselves back there. And I'm going to in a few minutes. How did people get ahead? Do you ever wonder about that? How do you move up in the social ladder? Because the Roman Empire was very socially stratified. Whatever caste or level of society you were born into, you were going to die in. So we must understand this culture in order to understand John's gospel. John's writing was so successful because he used an analogy that every person in the empire recognized instantly. And an analogy is as if, let's say I went on a job interview. And I come home, Heidi says, "How'd the job interview go?" And I said, "I hit a home run." It means I got the job, but I used a baseball analogy to tell that. Or if it didn't go so well, "How'd your interview go?" "I struck out." That's an analogy. So it doesn't mean that John approves of this analogy. He's just writing it to communicate to his audience. And he uses the way things really work in the Roman Empire as an analogy to tell us about Jesus and about us. Go to the next slide. Now, John starts his gospel with a prologue that's sort of like written in poetry. And unless you get the first verse right, you'll get lost. You won't get the point of the gospel. Now, at the end of the prologue, John writes this: "The Word became flesh and dwelt among us." He's talking about Jesus. "And we saw his glory, the glory as of the only begotten Son of the Father, full of grace and truth." He goes on to say, "We have all received from his fullness grace upon grace. Grace and truth came through Jesus Christ." And notice I put the word grace in quotations there. What is grace?
Unmerited good favor.
Unmerited favor? That's a theological answer. Theology is bunk. You can read thousands of pages of it. Throw it away.
I would consider it the love of God.
Yeah. But to the Roman Empire, it meant something else. This is the analogy. And the Bible uses grace throughout its pages. Noah found grace in the eyes of the Lord, as the author of Genesis says. Paul said, by grace are you saved through faith. But what does it mean? More importantly, what did it mean to the people who were the original audience of this gospel? The word translated grace in our Bibles is the word charis in the original Greek language. And it had a specific meaning in the Roman Empire. Just like words have a specific meaning to us. And Wendy's not here this morning, but let's say she sold you a piece of property and you signed the offer to buy. She would say, well, now you have to put up earnest money to show that you're in earnest to buy the property from the seller. And we all understand that, don't we? Well, grace was a technical term in the Roman Empire. So try to separate it from everything you've learned. It's a technical term. It's an economic term. And here's where it's going to get fun. Go to the next slide. We're going to pretend that it's AD 60. About 30 years after Jesus died, Nero Caesar is on the throne. He has a close childhood friend named Lucian, who was a poet. Lucian was the son of the tutor that educated Nero. In 60 AD, the empire had 60 million subjects. It spanned the entire Mediterranean basin, included France and Germany, and pretty soon would include England, all the way down to North Africa, from Gibraltar to Judea. The labor and production of 60 million people flowed into the city of Rome. That's why you have an empire. Follow the money. And there's no way to improve your status. None. The empire in the city of Rome had 900,000 residents. 40% of them were slaves. 45% of them were extremely poor. We think of Rome as a city built of concrete, granite, and marble, don't we? No, Rome was a big slum, except for the center of it where the elites lived. The poor of the city lived in wooden houses, 3 and 4 stories high, and they were always burning down. And then the elite would have to rebuild them and complain about that. 0.3% were wealthy. They were able to earn income by owning a business. That's about 2,500 people. The very top were the patrician class, dominated by 50 families. 50 families taking in all of the produce of 60 million people. Now, this patrician class, the heads of those families, were the senators in Rome. And whatever interfered with that flow of money, the senators took action to defend their money. And do you remember the story of Julius Caesar? Caesar was the head of one of those 50 families, but he wanted to do something for the poor. So he was assassinated in the Senate by senators. And that threw Rome into a civil war. It had been a republic run by the Senate, but after the civil wars, there was one guy who came out on top. His name was Octavian Caesar, Julius's nephew. He became known as Augustus Caesar, the very first emperor of Rome. And he loved to have his name on public buildings. Whole cities were named for him. Caesarea in the New Testament was named for Caesar. The Sea of Galilee in the Roman eyes was Lake Tiberias for Tiberius Caesar. In fact, if you walked into any Roman city, anywhere in the known world, in their world, when you went through the gate, above it, it would be written, built to the honor of Caesar, the Lord and Savior of the world. You can go and see these inscriptions. And, you know, for a person of my background, I read that and I think, did they get that language from the New Testament? No, the New Testament got that language from Rome. They said Jesus is the Lord and Savior of the world. But they meant specifically Caesar, the Roman emperor, is not the Lord and Savior of the world. So, after Rome became an empire, the Roman emperor still had to deal with that patrician class, who still watched out for their sources of money. So what do? You can't get rid of them all, but you can expand their ranks. If there are 50 in the patrician class, well, what if there were 100 instead of 50? What if there were 200? What if there were 1,000? Then the emperor could always have his way. And that's exactly what happened. The emperors sought supporters to raise to the ranks of the highest pinnacle of society. So, let's have some fun. Al Palmer, 60 AD, he owns a 1,000-acre vineyard in Tuscany. Put you in a good place, near Florence, beautiful place. And he is pretty well off, but he has a problem. He is afraid for the future of his vineyard and his family because the emperor could come and just take it away. A senator could come and just say, the Senate rules that your vineyard now belongs to me. Goodbye. That happened. But the problem is, Al produces although he produces the most delicious Chianti in the world, he is not of the patrician class. He's the descendant of farmers. How can he help protect what he has built through his whole life? Except if someone lifts him out of social obscurity and puts him at the top. And there's only one person in the world that can do that for you. And that's the Emperor of Rome. But Al doesn't know the Emperor of Rome. But he does know Lucian. Lucian's a poet, Al's a singer. You've sung some of Lucian's poetry. I don't know, you know him. And Lucian is known as a friend of Caesar. In fact, we know this. It's documented in history. We have his letters where he did what he did, what he's going to do for Al. We know he was acted as a friend of Caesar. So Al goes to Lucian, he says, explains his situation, you know. And Lucian says, okay, what do you want? And Al says, I would like to be appointed a senator of Rome. And Lucian said, well, that's a pretty big ask right off the bat. But we'll work on it. Answer me some questions. Are you loyal to Nero? And Al says, yeah. Do you love Nero? Cross my heart and hope to die, I love Nero. Are you devoted? Would you lay down your life for Nero? Yes. So Lucian looks at him and says, do exactly what I say. Take 2 gallons of your best wine and give it to me, because next week Nero is throwing a party and I'm going to take your wine to Nero's party. So Al, he gets his best wine, and he gives it to Lucian. Lucian takes it back. Party's going on. Lucian approaches Nero with a goblet of Palmer Winery Chablis. And he goes up to Nero and he said, "Do you know Al Palmer?" Nero said, "No, Al Palmer. He owns a vineyard in Tuscany and he makes the most delicious wine. Try it." Nero tries it and he said, "Wow, that is really good." Lucian says, "Well, Al Palmer is loyal to you, Nero. He loves you. He's devoted to you. He would lay down his life for you." And Nero said, "Well, it's good to know the country folk love me." Lucian writes to Al immediately after the party. He says, "It's going well. I've told your name to Nero. He knows that you're loyal to him. So do exactly what I say. I'm going to throw a party for Nero in a couple of weeks. And yours wine is going to be the only wine served. So send me 100 gallons of it. No, send me 150 gallons. We don't want to run out of wine, do we?" So Al does exactly what he's told. Nero shows up at the party. He's had several goblets of this delicious Chablis, and Lucian approaches Nero and he says, "This is Al Palmer's wine. Remember I told you about him?" "Yeah." "He loves you. He's loyal to you. He is devoted to you, Nero. Don't you think he would make a good senator?" Nero says, "Yeah, I've been looking for people to appoint to the Senate, because I want to screw the Senate class. So now we have to call him Senator Palmer." Nero had so much contempt for the Senate, he made his horse a senator. He brought it into the Senate, dressed in the regalia of a senator. Said, "This is what I think of you." Now that could have gotten him assassinated a couple of generations before, but there were plenty of senators who were loyal to Nero, who loved Nero and said they were devoted to Nero. So they just clapped. So Al is a senator. He didn't do anything other than what he was doing to become a senator. It was because the Roman emperor took him from his obscurity and raised him to the very pinnacle of society. Al is now having his pockets lined from the produce of 60 million people. That is called grace. And everybody in the Roman Empire knew it. That's how it worked. That's how things worked in Rome. Now what about grace unto grace? Well, Al has a next door neighbor who owns a 1,000-acre horse farm. His name is W.G. And W.G. has decided he wants to sell his horse farm and move to Spain because he wants to retire on the beaches of Spain. So he goes to Al, they're good friends, and he tells his story. But WG's got the same problem Al had. But now, Al is a friend of Caesar, isn't he? So WG says, "Hey, how about doing something for me, you know? I'd like to be the governor of Spain. Why not?" And Al says, "Okay, that's a big ask. Are you loyal to Nero? Do you love Nero? Are you devoted to Nero?" WG gives the right answer. So he says, Al says to WG, "Do exactly what I say. Let's take your most beautiful and fastest thoroughbred and take it to Rome and present it personally to Nero as a present from you to him. Because Nero loves his races in the Colosseum. And you're off. Pretty soon, 6 months later, Governor Ireland is basking on the beaches of Spain. That is grace unto grace, a friend of a friend. That's how it spreads. So the word grace is a technical thing that happened in Rome. And friend doesn't mean just a good buddy. Friend in the Roman Empire means someone who has his feet in both worlds, in Caesar's court and in the world. The friend was the one that bridged the gap. So friend doesn't mean what it means to us. It means like a real estate agent, just like the earnest money example I gave before. It means something technical. And we will find this throughout John's Gospel. Go to the next slide. The Jewish leadership seeking Christ's crucifixion said to Pontius Pilate, "If you release this man, you are not Caesar's friend." Does that put a different slant on that verse for you? You are not Caesar's friend. 4 verses later, Pilate caves, sends Jesus to be crucified. They could threaten him with the governorship of Judea, which is the position he held. They could threaten him, but when they threatened him with his friendship to Caesar, that's when he caved. Because being a friend of Caesar was far more important than any position that Pilate could hold. If you were a friend of Caesar, you had it made. So to be threatened with that's why he submitted Jesus to be crucified almost immediately afterward. Go to the next slide. This is from the first slide we had. "I no longer call you servants, for a servant does not know what his master does. But I have called you friends, for everything that I've heard from my Father I have made known to you." Jesus didn't call these people my friends. He said, "I call you friends, friends of God, because you have done everything I've told you to do." It's almost on every page once you know to look for it. Go to the next slide. Are you devoted to God? "Greater love hath no one than this, that he lay down his life for his friends." Now, how about the next slide? Remember I told you the Roman emperors actively sought supporters to raise them up the ranks? John 4:23-24. "Yet the hour is coming and is now here when the true worshipers will worship the Father in spirit and truth. For the Father seeks such to worship him." The analogy is that just as the emperor is looking for supporters, God is looking for those who will worship him in spirit and in truth, because God is spirit, and those who worship him must worship him in spirit and truth. Just another example of how this analogy is written throughout the gospel. Go to the next slide. So, the 7 mystical signs that Jesus does are signs that God gave Jesus to perform on earth to prove beyond a doubt that Jesus is the friend of God. And by doing exactly what he says, you too can become a friend. Next slide. I'm almost done here. The most dramatic scene the Gospel of John, in my opinion, is not the crucifixion. It's when Jesus confronts Pilate. Because this is the confrontation between the friend of the empire of Rome to the friend of the empire of heaven. Jesus told Pilate, "For this reason I came into the world, to bear witness to the truth." Notice how often truth has been in these slides. "Everyone who is of the truth hears my voice." That's another way of saying, become a friend of God. Everyone who is of the truth hears my voice. And Pilate said to Jesus, "What is truth?" and turned around and walked away. I used to believe, wow, I wish Pilate hadn't left. I'd like to hear what Jesus said to that Roman governor. But that's not what John is saying. John is saying there is no truth in the Roman Empire. None. There's no truth in a business empire. There's no truth in a religious empire. And there's one of those running in Rome to this day, shaped on the Roman Empire. But there is an empire where you have a friend who can lift you from the state of being a mortal human being to this point of becoming a divine, immortal being. The God of the universe is in the business of lifting people up. Lifting people up. Lifting people up. Now, John's gospel was successful. I mean, is it any wonder? It's written through every person who heard the gospel. So yeah, I know what that's all about. And they got the point. In 180 AD, about 120 years after the time we were talking about Al, 12 Roman citizens in the city of Carthage, North Africa, were hauled before the proconsul of Rome, the direct representative of Caesar. And the reason why they were hauled in front of the proconsul was because they refused to burn incense in worship of Caesar. Every year, citizens would have to take a scoop of incense and burn it to show that they worshipped, they were devoted, and they worshipped Caesar. These 12 refused. But these aren't just renegade people. These are Roman citizens. So the proconsul had to use care. And everything was written down in their trial. We know that because we have the transcript. So he understands it's a religious scruple of some kind. You know, they had some, by that time, the Roman elite had some knowledge of Christianity. So he said, how about instead of burning incense to worship Caesar, you just take a pinch of incense and burn it in recognition of the genius of Caesar. They still refused. The spokesperson for the 12 said this: "We do not recognize this empire. We serve a God that no one has seen. We do not recognize this empire, and we serve a God who cannot be seen," is directly from John's gospel. Directly. You Romans worship a man living in the city of Rome. Next year there'll be another one to replace him. I serve a God that can't be seen. He can only be seen in others. You have to have a friend of God to know God. This is the story of John's Gospel. This is the key to interpreting it. You can go home today and read it and understand it better. But this is also the story of thousands of novels, hundreds of films. Consider Star Wars. What's Star Wars about? It's about redemption, but also a young man from an obscure planet who defeats a human empire. What's the Lord of the Rings about? An obscure, obviously unqualified creature defeats evil in the universe. This is the original story that we've lost contact with. In the 113th Logion of the Gospel of Thomas, Jesus says, the empire of heaven is spread around the world, but no one sees it. We don't see the empire of heaven because we've lost contact with the original message. But if you become consciously aware of the message, life changes. Your perspective is transformed, and you start having a life of meaning and purpose and power and bliss. And if you don't think that the empire of heaven, that you can't see it, just remember this. What year is it? What year is it?
2026.
2026. Is it 2026 in China? Yep. Is it 2026 in India? Yep. Is it 2026 in Saudi Arabia? Yeah. So how come we measure time itself based upon the birth of an obscure Jewish peasant's birth? Because he was the original friend of God. And the promise to us is, if we do exactly what he says, we in turn can become friends of God. Go to the last slide. So, I'd like to leave on a practical level. I am a friend of God. Are you a friend of God? Are you loyal to God? Do you love God? Are you devoted? Ready to die if necessary? Does your life provide evidence that you're a friend of God? You'll have to answer for yourself. And one other point, on a practical level. Let's say some acquaintance comes to you and says, I know you're a spiritual person. You're reading all these books and you go to Unity Church and you're so happy all the time. What do I do to become more like you? Could you look at them and say, do exactly what I say? If you want to know exactly what that is, you'll have to sacrifice an hour of sleep starting next Sunday. Sacrifice an hour of sleep or learn the secrets of the universe. You weigh up the cost or benefit. I hope that you've learned something from this message. I hope it's been a blessing to you. I hope I've been able to bring the Gospel of John alive for you, because the Gospel of John is my favorite, it's the favorite of the world, and it's a favorite for a reason, but no one knows the reason. And today you have discovered the first step to the reason. So, now we're ready for our offering. And I'm not too late.
But this is something we haven't done, I don't think, for a minister.
You know, humility is the grace of ministry. Okay, let's see. Oh, I'm sorry. Well, we'll take up the offering first, how's that? Divine love, through me, blesses and multiplies all that I have, all that I give,